Who here can name a movie that was filmed in Cuba?
I can't.
I can't either.
The reason why it's so difficult to think of one is because from 1965 until 2015, the Cuban trade embargo made it prohibitively difficult for American filmmakers to make movies in Cuba. Only documentaries were allowed to film there, and even then, it was incredibly difficult for them to get access to the necessary filming permits. Since 2015, however, increased accessibility of these filming permits, the expansion of the types of movies that Americans can shoot in Cuba, and the improved relations between the United States and Cuba have all allowed for American directors to flock to the island en masse. Now, these American directors aren't just choosing to work in Cuba, they're choosing to work with Cubans, with the majority of these directors employing Cubans as a way to save money on making their movies. While this benefits them, it also presents them with unique challenges. Even the most experienced American filmmaker is woefully under-equipped when it comes to communicating with Cuban film crews because of the decades-long embargo. Making matters worse is the rapid reintroduction of American filmmakers have created feelings of hostility from Cubans. These two problems necessitate asking a question in order to find solutions. What beliefs and behaviors would an American director need to understand and enact in order to work effectively with the Cuban film crew? Tied to this question are two main ideas: the idea of Cuban hostility towards American filmmakers, and the idea of how cultural differences between the United States and Cuba manifest in their filmmaking. In order for American directors to work effectively with Cuban film crews, it's important that they first understand how their identities affect how they're perceived. Importantly, the identity of American filmmaker is perceived negatively by Cubans. Now, there are many reasons as to why this is, but the primary one is that since 2015, when American directors first arrived to the island, the costs of filming in Cuba have skyrocketed, which has effectively stopped the growth of Cuba's own independent film industry. While this may not necessarily be the fault of the American directors themselves, Cubans definitely place the blame squarely on their shoulders. Making matters worse is how Cubans are aware that they're being paid lower wages than they would be paid if they were American film crew members. All of this culminates in a general feeling that American directors are parasitical, that they are exploiting Cubans for their cheaper labor to no benefits of the Cubans. This, in turn, is strengthened by how Cuba has a collective culture and paints stronger distinctions between in-groups, i.e. other Cuban filmmakers, and out-groups, i.e. American directors, culminating in how American director has become an undesirable social identity in Cuba. It's important to note that this identity also holds a higher perceptual salience than other identities an American filmmaker may have. This can be seen through the experience of director Alex Malice, a director and second-generation Cuban diasporan who traveled to the island to film expecting to be greeted with open arms, but instead remarked that he felt like he was a stranger in his own culture. Understanding that it's difficult to find common ground between Cubans and Americans necessitates that these American filmmakers find unique solutions to this problem. Thankfully, understanding the sources of this hostility in turn creates several potential solutions for American directors hoping to mitigate it. The first source is that Cubans feel as if they're unable to make the movies they want to make because of American directors. To address this, it's important for American filmmakers to make their crews feel like whatever movie they're working on, it is their movie. And they can do this by instilling Cuban cultural values into their movies they're making. Now, interestingly, this is already facilitated to some degree by the ICAIC, which runs the Cuban film industry, because they suggest mandatory script edits to any films that do not adhere to Cuban cultural values. And while this is a simple, if mandatory, change to make, its benefits should not be understated. This can be seen through the work of director Bob Yari, who created the film Papa Hemingway in Cuba. Now, Ernest Hemingway, the subject of the film, is a beloved figure in Cuban culture, and as a result, Bob Yari was able to dodge the hostility that faces a lot of other American directors, even though at his own admission he knew next to nothing about the culture. Now, as effective as this solution is, it represents a compromise in artistic vision that is not always possible and seldom necessary. There are other ways to manage this hostility by looking at its second source. That being that Cubans feel as if they're not seen as legitimate collaborators, as if their time and their work is being exploited purely because it's cheaper than employing Americans. American directors can mitigate this source of hostility by actively seeking out conversations and advice from their Cuban filmmakers. In these conversations, they should enact Cuban cultural values. Failure to do so could risk alienating their Cuban film crews even further. Two important values that they should enact during conversations are eye contact, which is all but a mandate in Cuban culture for any type of conversation, and proxemic use of standing closely to their conversational partners. This is seen in Cuban culture as a sign of openness and friendliness. The mere act of engaging with Cubans in conversation could also help move them away from sociocultural data, from fixating on how they are talking to an American filmmaker and working with one, to focusing on psychocultural data, evaluating the American director on the basis of their own personality. Now, all of this comes with a caveat. Cuba does in fact have a high power distance culture, and as a result, it would be seen as strange and defy cultural expectations if an American director asked for too much advice or was too friendly. Of course, communication is not a one-way street. Just as there are elements of American filmmaking that Cubans may not like, so are there differences in Cuban and American culture that in turn lead to differences in how they make movies that Americans may find difficult to accept. The first difference between the United States and Cuban culture is that while the United States has a monochromatic culture, Cuba has a polychromatic culture. And as a result, while the United States emphasizes strict schedules and set deadlines, Cuba does not do either of these things, which absolutely manifests in filmmaking. Americans aren't going to get the short 14-day shoot schedules that they expect when working in Cuba. And by not expecting this, this means that they're going to go over time, which means that they're going to spend more money than they expect to, which means that they're going to burn through all the money they saved by employing Cubans in the first place. It can also create another problems, where American filmmakers believe that Cubans aren't willing to work as long of hours or adhere to such strict deadlines because they're lazy or they don't care about the film. Neither of these are necessarily the case. It's merely a difference in cultural values, and so either of these will be internal attributions and attribution errors. Understanding this difference and the problem it creates then necessitates looking at some solutions. While American filmmakers may be tempted to simply move the start times of shoot days earlier, that would be a mistake. Despite what it seems like with all the pictures of Cuba featuring their vintage cars driving through nicely paved streets, very few Cubans actually drive, especially on the outskirts of their major cities. In fact, a lot of these Cubans that American filmmakers would be employing live outside these cities and as a result take public transport, which can add as much as 3 hours to their commute times, meaning that moving the start of shoot days earlier is logistically difficult, if impossible. Instead of having their Cuban film crew start their shoot days sooner, they should instead seek to have them stick to stricter schedules while they are there. While this may be difficult, since it's still violating Cuban cultural norms, I believe that it is possible, because American directors can bank off of their high power distance culture to have their word taken as law and their schedule adhered to. While Cuba's time orientation may affect how long they are willing to work, Cuba's high context culture influences what happens while they are at work. While America has a relatively low context culture, and as a result is much more willing to say hard truths, Cuba is much more worried about not saying things if they believe that they will upset their conversational partner, which absolutely affects how films are made. If something goes wrong on set, it may take a long time for American directors to find out about it, if they find out at all. As a solution to this, American directors should try to reframe openness and willingness to share problems on set as a way to bolster personal relationships and not as something that would hinder them. Doing this will play to Cuba's feminine culture, which places strong emphasis on the strengthening of interpersonal relationships. In conclusion, by understanding the hostility directed at American filmmakers, by understanding how Cuba's polychromic high-context culture affects how they make movies, and by understanding what key behaviors to enact, American filmmakers will have a much higher likelihood of communicating and working effectively with Cuban filmmakers. All of this in turn emphasizes the practical applications of studying intercultural communication for a variety of industries, and ultimately, it emphasizes the shared values between excellent filmmaking and excellent intercultural communication, the ability to bring people together. Thank you.